Hello everybody, welcome to another video. It is already the 10th of August and today we're looking at so many updates, so we're going to keep it very concise. I can't go in depth about really any part of the front line, which really disappoints me to say, but nonetheless we are going to be covering a lot of the events unfolding, starting off with the situation in the Sumy region going into Kursk itself. We're going to look at some of the latest footage and just give you guys a bit more clarification on the situation now that the dust hasn't completely settled, but now we have a better understanding of where we should generally mark the front line to be. Because in my first video yesterday, which was really the first time that I actually looked at the developments in depth, and I did a 40-minute video on it, I was looking a lot at some of the maps that were publicized by Russian sources like Rybar. And the issue is with Rybar and with a lot of these other sources is the fact that sometimes they overestimate the extent of Ukraine's initial advances, and this could be generally an honest mistake, or it could be that they're purposefully bloating Ukraine's controlled sphere of influence, you could say, in order to then decrease that once we get more facts and the situation becomes more clear, and then it could sort of act as a Russian counterattack. But in reality, perhaps the Ukrainians were never in those positions in the first place, and they were always under Russian control. And so, yeah, you have to just sort of refrain from taking everything they say with face value as with any other source. And so I've sort of balanced it out now by sort of aggregating the mapping made by Deep State and by Rybar, because Deep State's been much more conservative and most Ukrainian channels have. There are some that are more fringe that have actually been very excessive in terms of the gains they've shown on the Ukrainian side. But in terms of their sort of really outlandish claims by some of these Ukrainian Telegram sources, for instance, a lot of them just show these very narrow Ukrainian advances along several roads, getting very, very deep into Kursk Oblast itself. But again, there's no actual confirmation of these spearheads. In fact, if they ever did reach these points, which we're going to get into, then it seems like that at this point, the Russian forces have been able to push them back from some of these more fringe positions. But we do have a good idea of where the Ukrainians actually do have a presence within settlements and tree lines based on geolocated footage and based on just a general consensus. And so, August 8th really was an important day, as I said before, because it could have been a day where we saw the Ukrainians just continue to capitalize on their previous advances from August 7th and continue advancing along certain key highways like the R200 over here, which leads to this really important intersection southwest of Kursk. That's one area. Also towards the city of Logov, that's a really important area that the Russians is really incumbent upon them to secure as soon as possible. And the same thing applies for the road from Sverdlikovo all the way to the northwest where Korenovo is located. And so, yes, Russian sources did report even today that there has been a lot of movement of Ukrainian mobile elements. But in terms of any sort of massive change from August 7th in terms of the Ukrainians being able to infiltrate deep into new settlements, that hasn't happened, at least today. We're going to have to wait and see what happens over the next few days. I'll give my thoughts on that. And then, of course, overnight, this is when we see a lot of Ukraine's DRG units operating. So they're definitely trying to sabotage any sort of Russian remnants that are currently holding the front line, for instance, in an area like Suzhia, or to the west in areas like Olgovka or Korenovo. So DRGs are crossing the border at night, and there are many, many squads involved in this operation. You also have the efforts of the SBU Alpha Group, which has moved from the Kherson region to get involved in some of these clandestine operations with the support of the Project M2 drone unit, which is a SBU FPV drone group. They've been involved in a lot of these strikes on Russian forces, especially ones that are at the front line and are just trying to really contain any sort of future Ukrainian advance. And so that's really the role of the SBU over here. And then, of course, you have engineering elements that have started crossing over the border and new units that are beginning to work on building defenses and beefing up the ones that the Russians have already set up. And I will be adding in more overlays to show you guys the full extent of the Russian defenses over here, because the Ukrainians do have a lot under their control in the span of the border that is actually controlled by them. and they are trying to convert it into a static defensive position that could be used in the future to repel any sort of Russian attacks. And that's the next stage for the Ukrainian side, because really their initial objective, which we still see to a certain extent even today, but has decreased in its efficacy, were these sort of massive advances by mechanized forces, just many, many columns zooming through highways, just bypassing any sort of small groups of Russian forces, and then letting the rear work on clearing them out afterwards. That's been the general Ukrainian strategy. And as they were sort of bypassing, they overlooked some remnants and pockets of Russian resistance that are, of course, in a horrible position right now, really, really disadvantageous, but they have not been completely subdued. And so that's something the Ukrainians still have to work on. And that should be their number one goal, because the Ukrainians, in order to turn this into a successful and defensible position in the long term, I don't know if they want to keep this sort of short term in the sense of a month or two, or if they want to keep this as a sort of long term salient going into 2025 as a bargaining chip. Really, regardless, they do need to protect their flanks, if not for anything else, just for the safety of their own forces that are continuing to push deeper along the central sort of axis. And so they need to secure their flanks, whether it be in an area like Sudzha or even further westwards, maybe not getting control of Korenova immediately, but definitely having more depth in some of these fields in villages that are located rather close to some of the few roads that the Ukrainians really are relying on for all these advances. And so just going through the timeline for August 8th, just for a second, and August 9th as well, I should say, you have the fact that the 22nd Brigade was largely involved in efforts north of Sudzha in order to just clear out any sort of remnants, whether it be in Koschaya, Loknia, or Martinovka, where there probably is still a Ukrainian presence, although now it's largely disputed by Russian sources. A lot of Ukrainian sources and even Russian sources, even 2 days ago, were pretty much in unison about this being captured by the Ukrainians. And so I don't know if this has changed. This is one of those areas where there's a question mark, but I do still I do still believe that there may be a Ukrainian presence over here, because of how deep the initial Ukrainian advance along this highway was. So it's not like they were completely pushed back all the way back to the border, but you definitely did have elements. I think it was from the 22nd Brigade, maybe the 88th Brigade. There are conflicting reports about which unit was actually involved in this spearhead, but let's say the 88th, that continued and bypassed Sudzha without completing the capture of the eastern bank of the city, and then just zoomed all the way to Bolshoi Solodetskoy. And the goal of this was to just completely take over a lot of the local nodes that are used for command control and logistics before the Russian reinforcements could arrive. And so the 88th was probably trying to do that. But by the time they arrived over here with some of their mechanized columns, there already had been an influx of reinforcements, not anything too massive. And most of the garrison was still not actually consisting of reinforcements, whether they be from Belgorod or from even further away from Krasnodar region, where we know some of them have come from. They're actually largely from remnants of the border guard and from the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment. And so these are, again, not the best forces. A lot of them really are just conscripts, but they were able to hold out and push back any sort of Ukrainian contingent over here back to Martinovka. And so now, as the Ukrainians can't really immediately expand their hiatus, a really important goal should be to at least solidify what they have already taken under their control in order to prevent their flanks from being undermined. The best place to do that is by getting control of Sudzha, which, as I mentioned in my last video, served as the center for the sort of Kursk selection, the Kursk component of the northern group of forces. And in Kursk, it should have been around 10,000 Russian soldiers defending in this region, or at least operating here, but probably was much less when the Ukrainians broke through in this region initially. And so now we're seeing that because Sudzha did still serve as a really important nexus in the region, that there are still holdouts and that they haven't been fully cleared out. This has been clarified by basically all sides at this point. You could look at Deep State's reporting, for instance. Rybar's adjusted their maps to also indicate that the eastern region is still contested with a lot of Russian presence still there from pockets of the 488th regiment, I believe, yeah. And they are being assaulted from the north, from the 88th Brigade, and then from the south, they're putting pressure, I believe, the 22nd Brigade or it could be the other way around. But regardless, you do have these two sort of pincers being created, especially from the south. This is where a lot of the pressure is severe because you do have the heights that are overlooking much of the river valley on which the eastern suburbs are located, like Mondarevka or Mirny. And so the Ukrainians really are taking advantage of that. And of course, they're also utilizing some auxiliary forces like the Georgian Legion. I believe the Georgian Legion actually does have more of a presence further westwards, so we're going to get to that later on. In the center, because I'm just going to be using different directions to refer to the parts of the front line here. So the central region, it sort of really consists of this region over here, where you see the two parallel lines. Before we get to that, I just want to look at some geolocations from Suzia, recent ones that confirm a Ukrainian presence. Over here, this is a photo from August 6th, so it doesn't matter. This one over here is actually a Ukrainian soldier being pictured in front of a store in Zaulashenko. So this is how we know that they are in the western suburbs at the very least. That's not really disputed by anyone anymore. Here's an interesting video. It's from August 9th. It's from the 99th Battalion of the 61st Mechanized Brigade. As you recall, I said it was a rumor this unit was moved from the Novomikhailivka-Vuhledar region to attack in Suzia, but now we know that at least one battalion has actually been moved and is involved in these operations. So, yeah, that backs up what I was saying previously. We don't know the full information about the other brigades I mentioned, but this one, at least partially, has been confirmed to be operating around here. And they're involved in helping out the 22nd and 88th with their combing operations here. And so they filmed that video in front of the Gazprom building. And again, the gas metering station was captured by the Ukrainians, I believe. And so that hasn't actually affected the flow of gas, I believe, into Europe and especially into Hungary. I haven't seen any changes in the levels, and I think Gazprom also confirmed that. But yeah, that is under Ukrainian control, and so is the western portion along with the northern flank. Looking a bit to the west, I want to look at the central axis for a second because Russian local sources confirm that 90% of Malaya Lokhnia is under Ukrainian control. So at the present moment, vast majority is Ukrainian controlled, and there's probably some Russian reinforcements and remnants that are operating in nearby villages just to the north. But in terms of the battle here, it seems that the Ukrainians are successful. What happened was you had mobile elements of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade now being supported by a new battalion tactical grouping created by the 80th Air Assault Brigade, located over here, I believe. And so together they were able to push northwards directly and take over that village. And so for now, that serves as a sort of forward glue that is protecting all of the eastern and western flanks, just to give the Ukrainians a bit more depth in this region and a sort of coordinating points along a key road that advances northwards. But all the talk about the Ukrainians reaching into like Kromsky, Biki, or rather deep into an area like Ivnitsa, which was mentioned 1 or 2 days ago, that is not true. The Ukrainians probably did try ambushes over here with some of their maybe Martyr, Striker, and even tank companies advancing along this particular road, but they were repelled by the Russian garrisons that are really manning in this region. And so for now, the line has sort of stabilized, and a lot of this is due to the reinforcements, as we said before, and we'll get to that in a second. Looking a bit westwards, there is some ambiguity. This may be the most ambiguous part of the front line because Deep State says that Nikolaevka Darino is not under Ukrainian control, that attacks were repelled over there. They don't say that Obuchovka is under Ukrainian control. They also deny that Snagost is under the control of the Ukrainians. And that's really significant because all of those regions are consisting of this core that includes several heights that overlook Korenovo, and of course would give the Ukrainians control of the southern flank of that city. And so I can't say which one is true because Rybar, they still have the mapping sort of looking like this, also admitting that the Ukrainian axis over here has sort of diminished in recent hours, but they haven't said that all these 3 villages have fallen back into Russian hands. And so for now, I'm just a bit clueless as to what's exactly happening. I think that situation really is fluid in that Ukrainians may have been here, they may have been expelled at a certain point, but that they really aren't able to get solid control over all these frontline villages, which is understandable given the strategy that they are partaking in. But if that's going to change in certain regions, then we're beginning to see that, but not near the front line. We're seeing that in villages that are closer to the border, like Yuzhny. That's an area where we know there is a solid Ukrainian presence with actually men on foot located over there. And then even Deep State's disputing the status of Lyubiomivka and various other villages over here. So yeah, really keep an eye out for that. At the very least, Deep State admits that the Ukrainians have taken over Darino, and I don't know if these claims by Deep State are in relation to operational secrecy, if they want to sort of fool Russians and not give away positions. I really have no idea. And so that's why we have to just remain skeptical of every single source, even if they are reporting on news that is negative to their own side. Looking at some of the garrisons over here the Russians have, of course, there was the Akhmat Sapad battalion, and we talked about that before. They have not been that engaged in the recent fighting, but I think that they are beginning to play a role in sort of stabilizing the front line. What we do know is that this Russian Air Force Motor Rifle Regiment of the VKS, that's the unit that helped repel a lot of the Ukrainian mechanized assaults towards Koranovo. So they've had a big deal in preventing the situation from further deteriorating, because the loss of Koranovo really would have put Rylsk itself in danger, and by that point it would be a really massive collapse for the entirety of the Russian logistic structure within Kursk. And at this point, it's not looking like that. And it's because some of these units over here that really were understaffed and are of a lower caliber were able to hold out just enough against a really fast Ukrainian advance that disregarded solidifying control. And here you just have a few of the other units. Of course, I said Piatnachka yesterday, and we talked about a few of the mercenary units and special forces coming from Donetsk. There was also a Spetsnaz unit, I think it's called Aida, which is involved now in striking Ukrainian columns. And so all of these various eclectic groups of forces have come in. A lot of them specialized, having combat experience. Not most of them not really having any sort of immediate frontline experience, in the sense that they weren't actively engaged in combat right before being moved. Most of them were resting, I believe, before they were rotated. And that's a part of the thinking of why they were moved in the first place. That they didn't want to rush the Russians. They didn't want to take away from other parts of the front line too much, but of course it will always feed into a certain extent. And so the region that's being impacted the most by this is the northern group of forces in Belgorod. So yes, definitely a lot of the units from this region have been moved to the north along the routes over here to the west and along the rail lines into Kursk, and then from there along the E38 highway and dispersed towards the actual frontline engagements. And so that will have an immediate effect on the situation in Vovchansk and make it more difficult for the Russians to continue engaging in offensive activities over there. So yeah, in that regard, it will be helpful for the Ukrainians when it comes to diverting forces from the immediate vicinity. But then again, they also diverted forces from Vovchansk. They diverted away the 82nd Brigade, and they also diverted at least the corner group of the 116th Brigade, which is a drone unit which is now confirmed to be fighting and providing support for the Ukrainians in Kursk. And I'm now mentioning them because they recorded this really interesting video showing a nighttime HIMARS strike, which was conducted on the E30 highway. And this is after we got on August 8th all these videos of Russian reinforcements with these massive columns all headed towards the front line. And they were just sort of huddling together overnight near Rylsk in some of these villages. And they were doing so unwittingly while being spotted by the Ukrainian side and while then actually being targeted by their HIMARS. I believe this is the first HIMARS strike on the Kursk region during this offensive engagement. As you can see in the video, which I've linked here, the first strike, it strikes sort of the western tip of the column, and the column has 15 vehicles. And then the other few strikes hit more so the eastern tip. And so it didn't actually destroy the entire column because it wasn't equally dispersed. And of course, I don't want to be too nitpicky about the situation because it still did achieve many direct hits. But it does mean that a large chunk of the center of the column was able to get out of their trucks prematurely and then survive the strike. But still, we saw that at least 3 of the trucks were just completely burnt and suffered really horrible damage. And so you could assume that all of the men that were within those trucks at the same time were also killed. And then, of course, men from other trucks that were damaged but weren't completely burnt, they may have also suffered casualties. And so there's a debate ongoing about how many were actually killed. I would say that it's not more than a company size. It could be even less, but I'd say it's in the several dozens, maybe even high dozens. But I don't want to specify exactly because I don't really have an honest idea. But yeah, all the 14 trucks and the one UAZ 425 loaf van were either damaged or destroyed as a result. And it is just really a big issue that within all the commotion and the urgent need for reinforcements, that they had to just frantically move in a lot of resources. and then didn't think about the consequences. And that's just the natural result of that the Ukrainians are going to see these sort of things and then, of course, respond accordingly. And the reason they're able to do this is in large part because they've been able to hack into the CCTV cameras of the major highways and also of cities and of residential areas of homes. And so they've been getting, as a result of this hacking, a lot of information on Russian movements. But they don't even need to do that in a lot of cases because we've seen the Russian media actually publicly show everybody where the columns are headed in order to sort of instill this sense of calmness that the situation is under control. The issue is, of course, like that could be soothing seeing it on camera, but then the Ukrainians also see that, and it's very easy to geolocate. There's like a sign of Kursk in the background, and you see all of these various systems, whether they be self-propelled howitzers, anti-air guns, tanks, whatever it may be. A lot of artillery systems, Grad MLRS, for instance, and that all is seen publicly along a notable road. And then the Ukrainians, of course, have the ability to then strike those regions with reconnaissance drones fixing their artillery. So really, that is just a byproduct of the carelessness caused by the commotion. Yeah, and the Ukrainians also conducted many other deep strikes recently. And this is something they really have to do. They urgently have to continue this. And I don't know what's the status of ATACMS in the Kursk region, because I know, of course, it was authorized for Belgorod region and also a lot of other American systems, but I don't know if that applies to Kursk at the moment. I don't even think the Americans were briefed on the Ukrainian attack in the first place, and there hasn't really been much talk about that. What we do know is that this was a drone strike. It wasn't using missiles, but it was a mass swarm of drones targeting the Lipetsk region. Russian authorities say that they shot down 19 drones in this region. Well, clearly there were more than 19 because there was serious damage suffered, not to the airframes located over here in the Lipetsk air field, but to the ammo depot located right over here, where you could see that I have it linked over here, but there's just this massive amount of damage that was caused to the ammo depot, and it's like about 1.5 kilometers away from it. Now, I can't confirm if this is true because it was just something that was written by Radio Free Europe, I think, and they said that it was reported to them that there were 700 guided bombs located here, so I'm assuming some of them may have been fabs with the UMPK kits, but I don't know if it's actually 700. Definitely there were some missiles here, also or rocket artillery, whatever it may be, and that's why the Ukrainians struck it, because they don't want the Russians sending in their artillery systems filled with ammo towards the front line, and they don't want the Russian Air Force in this region where there are dozens of fighter jets and helicopters located in this airfield that probably could be sent for sorties near the border, whether they be Su-34s, Su-35s, MiG-31s, with the UMPK kits. And for now, it seems like most of the fab strikes aren't actually utilizing the UMPKs, so they may not even be utilizing fabs that much. They're using more so conventional weapons. That's been what's widely reported, and that's just a byproduct of the urgent need to at least strike something. So they're not really thinking about whether it's a UMPK sort of based glide bomb kits or not. They're not thinking about that. They just want to strike targets immediately. But of course, as time goes on, that situation will change. And the only way for the Ukrainians to sort of dampen the blow would be to target those stockpiles on the rear. And so that's what we're sort of seeing here. And also the Ukrainians report that they were able to destroy in the Donetsk region, actually, at least one S-350 radar for the S-350 air defense system, and then perhaps 2 S-300 radars, but that's still something that they're working on verifying. And so that's really it for this part of the front line. I want to see if there are a few other units that the Ukrainians moved in that we can take note of, because there was mention of this unit here, Nightingale drone units. It's a part of the 14th Drone Regiment, just this assortment of drone units that are put together into a single organized regiment. And so now some of their resources are around here. And what I've been hearing from Western media, they've talked to some Ukrainian sources. They're saying that the immediate objectives are not completely clear. The Ukrainians have been very secretive about the sort of inner workings of their operation, but that they can see the amount of Ukrainian resources committed being proportional to the amount of attention that the Russians give to it. And so that's something that is very interesting to keep in mind. Also, American officials talking to Western media said that they don't expect the Ukrainians to be stationed over here permanently, that it isn't going to be something that's a permanent fixture. also that I can't really say for sure if that's true. That's just America's own assessment, and we know that that could be really dependent on factors that are very volatile, and so I wouldn't read too much into it now. But I want to begin by looking now at the Pokrovsk direction, but first Toretsk, because there are some just massive changes around here. Not necessarily around Toretsk, but more so around New York that need to be mentioned, and then we'll go to Pokrovsk and Vuhledar. So in yellow, you see the advances from recent days, probably past 48 hours. Here to the west of Yurivka, the Russian forces have been able to take over additional heights that overlook this chain of villages here, Alexander Peel, all the way up to Sukhabalka. So the Russians are really serious about taking over this chain of villages at some point, but it also helps them strengthen the western flank of their New York axis as they hope to sort of breach the defense line that is located near the New York road over here. Now, they also tried to get control over this bridgehead located in northwestern New York, but this did not have as much success. As we zoom in, you can see that the Ukrainians were able to retake school number 38, which initially the DPR units from the 9th, I believe, Brigade were able to take over. So here's a video from the 53rd Brigade, Ukrainian units raising the Ukrainian flag in school number 38, confirming that there was a localized counterattack. You can see that as a result, the Ukrainians advanced around 450 meters. This was important because it really losing this region would put the center of New York in great danger, including the industrial zone and the nearby sort of apartments and large structures. All of that would be in danger. But because there is at least some Ukrainian pushback, it sort of bogs down the fighting. It prevents that from immediately happening. So there won't be any sort of collapse of the line here. Looking a bit eastwards, there was also this video from the Skala Battalion showing that their Bradley aids a dozen Ukrainian troops in a counterattack in New York. And the fact that it was even filmed over here along Korolivska Road indicates that the Russians at some point were able to cross over the river and begin infiltrating into residential areas. But that for now, at least, the Skala Battalion has been able to contain the situation. So that's the situation from there right now. Now looking at the Pokrovsk direction, as we talked about Sumy and Kursk, nothing really changed here in terms of the scale. The Russians really are still very involved in pushing forward. Any of the units that we talked about, like mercenary units or DPR units that were moved away, they were not engaged in advancing here in the past month, and so it hasn't really had an effect. Maybe it has the effect of sort of slightly diminishing the amount of reserves the Russians have in the region and their ability to rotate. But in terms of the sort of current changes, none of it has been affected. I guess the only effect would be that there are less Air Force sorties conducted by the Russians over the skies here because they need to be urgently sent away to defend in Kursk. That is true. But on the ground, the Russians are still advancing. South of Novoselivka-Persha, you could see an advance, half a square kilometer. Also, just getting close to Mezhove, the Russians are closing in on some of the remaining fields east of the Vavcha River as the Ukrainian units make their final withdrawal from this region. Looking westwards, Shelane has now been largely captured by the Russians. The Russians here, they were able to squeeze out the Ukrainians as a result of their various axes, whether it be from the west, from the north, from the east, west, or north. All of them have been involved in a concerted effort, these Russian vectors, to close in, pin down Ukrainians, fire on their supply lines, and then as a result, cause high casualties and force them out. So that's what happened. And now the Ukrainians are hoping to sort of set up this new temporary line from Novozhelane to Komishivka to Mezhove. Now, you could already see that the Russians will be trying to do the same sort of flanking operations, and it's going to be a question of whether the Ukrainian garrison here has been able to reinforce itself and reorganize in a timely manner, or whether they are still in a state of disarray and cannot really maintain control of this glue of several villages that are tightly packed together. And so you really shouldn't be able to flank these villages because of how close they are together. Zhelana didn't really have that besides Serhivka, and so it is a bit different. But if it could be done here further southwards, then it would really mean that the defensive integrity of the Pokrovsk region is in larger danger. So just keep an eye out for the changes over there. But looking westwards, that's just as important, if not more important, for the Russians right now, where the Russians were able to get control over Serhivka. You can see the Russians captured on the 9th of August, I believe it was, or 8th, 8.6 square kilometers. That's just a massive amount of land to be capturing in a single day. and it could have happened over the course of several days and was only verified that time. But still, you're looking at really massive advances in capture of villages at the same time, whole villages. So here the Russians advance a maximum of 2.2 kilometers westwards, getting control over a large amount of the river valley on which Hordivka is located, and then extends southwards into Serhivka through. And so a lot of these routes are being taken over by the Russians and then could be utilized to begin pushing into Hordivka itself. And so we're just seeing the initial stages of the capture of Hordivka as a result. And so a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements that were sort of sent to defend in Vesele and Ivanivka, they're trying to coalesce around Hordivka and turn that into a defense node. The issue is just south of the city, there is this massive height that is currently under Ukrainian control, but could very easily fall to the Russians, given how they're pushing through the fields around Serhivka at the present moment. And then that would not only put Hordivka in danger, but also the supply line between that city and actually Mirnorod and the southern outskirts of Mirnorod. So it's really now become a part of the Overton window discussions of Mirnorod because of Russia's recent advances towards Hordivka. It could also, of course, put in danger all of the nearby villages like Orlivka and, of course, even Novohordivka, which also serves as an important defense node in the region. And at that point, you're looking at danger to Selidove from the north, but we're not going to go down that sort of Pandora's box. Of course, now you could see that the Russians were able to advance about 1.5 kilometers along the local road towards Hordivka, and you don't see many defenses over here, so it's going to be a big issue, and a lot of Ukrainian forces will have to be rediverted to preventing any sort of deep infiltration into such an urban cluster. You could also see that the Russians are advancing in Ivanivka, an advance amounting to 1.6 kilometers, really massive, almost all of the villages under Russian control in a matter of days. And that is really an issue because it spells the end for Lysychnia and various other villages along the Torets River. And what's the consequence of that? The northeastern flank of Hordivka is also basically going to be compromised. And so really the garrison that's going to be sort of pushed back into a corner here in the city, they're going to be exposed from a lot of directions and overlooked from a lot of places. It's going to make it much more difficult to advance or to defend in those regions. You could also see the Russians taking over this small chunk of territory, advancing slightly to the west towards the village of Lysychnia. So we know the Russians are still pushing from Timofivka. And then lastly, here we have the small Russian advance. It's this gain just south or just sort of west of Novolokhandrivka. Russian forces trying to take over the final heights that are located south of Vozhvizhenka in order to allow them to finally clear out the Ukrainian defensive node in that region. So here we have a video that was released by the 401st Rifle Battalion of FPV strikes onto a Russian squad occupying the tree lines south of the village. And now the fact that the Russians are even pushing in this direction and that they're very close to taking it over means that this roadblock over here, this really key path, will finally be accessible to the Russians. There no longer will be a Ukrainian strong point in the region. And then that means that there is sort of a free passage. There aren't any settlements afterwards from Vozhvizhenka all the way to the this really important ring road that we always mention, which is only about 4.5 kilometers away from the current line of contact. But now we know that there is another unit involved in trying to hold the line here, which we previously weren't aware of. And finally, just a quick recap of the Konstantinivka-Vuhledar front. Russians really are shaping the battlefield here, trying to take over the final fields east of the highway. That is really a big part of their goal. First, we have this sort of footage confirming further Russian infiltrations into Konstantinivka. Here you can see it is a very small piece of territory, but it's based on geolocated footage that I've marked here with this icon. You could see that it's from August 6th actually, but it shows FPV and grenades from 79th Air Assault Brigade dropping onto infantry in trenches and hiding under vehicles. And so several vehicles were also destroyed in this video, but it also shows that really this very arduous process for Russian soldiers has allowed them to at the very least get into some of the houses. But you can see that it is still a very small part of the entire village, and the Ukrainians really are using these initial sort of entry points as kill zones for Russian forces as they push forward. And then looking a bit south, Russian forces have been able to take over 6 square kilometers through these fields, clearing out a lot of Ukrainian tree lines and dugouts that were built up in recent months, advancing a maximum of 2.5 kilometers. Really big gains towards Vodyane. Vodyane is now in closer danger, and the Russians are continuing to advance along this very important ridge that I'm marking with these two rectangles. Further south, you also had a capture of about 1.6 square kilometers. Russian forces just continuing to get control of regions north of Mikilsk, and this is a part of preparation for then eventually taking over the sort of coal mining facility and the shafts here, which will help with flanking Vuhledar itself from the northeast. And so, yeah, that's all left for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.